So good evening, everybody. Tonight we have the inaugural event of a wonderful partnership that the university has established with the Alliance Française, Adelaide. It's also a lecture by His Excellency Mr. Christophe Lecourtier as Ambassador of France to Australia as well. So welcome this evening. So tonight I'm delighted to launch our recently signed Memorandum of Understanding and Partnership between the University of South Australia and Alliance Française d'Adelaide. This is a partnership which will promote French society, language and culture, and importantly, the relationship between France and Australia.
Now, the Alliance Française of Adelaide is but one link in the growth of all things French in South Australia. And the role of partnerships generally, and certainly for the Alliance here in Adelaide, is very important. And why? Well, because we truly now live in a global world, and the better we know each other, the better we can work together. We thank the University of South Australia for being a partner with us, and we look very much forward to working together into the future to deliver a whole heap of other French activities which is going to benefit a whole wide range of people and communities. Thank you very much.
His Excellency Christophe Lecourtier took up his position as Ambassador of France to Australia in July 2014. He's been a frequent visitor to Adelaide and to UniSA, and he's supported and joined the work of UniSA's Hawke EU Centre on various occasions. Tonight, the title of his lecture is France and Australia Together in a Time of Challenges and Uncertainties. Please join with me in giving a very warm welcome to Christophe Lecourtier.
Good evening to all of you. First, it's a great pleasure for me to acknowledge the presence of many people I know, and I'm always happy to meet and here in Adelaide. First, Mrs. Catherine Hilliard, MP, representing Minister Susan Close, a very good partner of France in this state, and also representing the Premier Jay Weatherill. The Honourable, my dear friend Jan Hunter, Minister for Sustainability, Environment and Conservation, Minister for Water and the River Murray, Minister for Climate Change. And you know, our climate change is important for the French. I'll come back to that a bit later. The Honourable Kelly Vincent, MP. Of course, Mr. Nigel Ralph, Deputy Vice-Chancellor of the University of South Australia. Sorry, I forgot Minister Zoe Bettison, Minister for Social Inclusion. Professor Anthony Elliott, Executive Director of the EU Centre. Dear Brian Fay, President of the Alliance Française, and many other friends. Let me first tell you how, of course, delighted I am to be with you tonight, but also a bit anxious about delivering the very first lecture of a series of 27, of course, regarding the relationship between Australia and the European Union. I'll try not to be too long, keeping in mind the words of the wife of a famous ambassador. Remember, darling, for a speech to be immortal, it should not be eternal. More seriously, when we look around us, there is no doubt that Australia and France, but not only Australia and France, are today facing an uncertain, if not deeply dangerous world. Let me just mention some of the most acute challenges all of you have in mind, especially when you think about France, the threat of terrorism, which feeds on the conflicts in the Middle East and is weighing on our countries and on our societies. It will take time and energy to overcome it, for it is the complex product of deadly nihilist propaganda which resonates with young people who lack bearings and who often face difficulties in integrating a problem we, France, have not addressed sufficiently. This results in a major challenge to our values, our freedoms, and our democracy. It also gives way to a distorted caricature of Islam, of which Muslims themselves are the first victims. But many more enemies challenge today our democracies. Cyber threats, for instance, they are becoming reality, with direct consequences for our most vital interests. We've recently learned, following especially the US elections, for instance, that these are not only aimed at our armed forces and critical infrastructure, but also at our democratic institutions and electoral processes. More obvious for most of us, even if sometimes denied, are the effects of climate change and environmental degradation. They lead to misery and destruction, but also prepare the terrain for future conflicts over access to food, water, and other natural resources. I want to stress that these risks are not naturally occurring risks. They are the result of our activities, of human activities. But these are not the only threats weighing on our societies and on our future. We are also confronted with populism, which in the United States, Europe, and elsewhere is pushing for isolationism and more protectionism. It raises questions. Aren't those who present themselves as critics of the systems actually attacking democratic institutions? Haven't those who propose to build walls and close borders any solutions for the security of our nations? Won't they eventually threaten our prosperity? I'm afraid that by preaching isolationism, populists are mistaken on both the diagnosis and the remedy. I will come back later to that. According to me, there is something absolutely clear. The difficulties we need to address require, on the contrary, greater collective action, greater international cooperation, and greater multilateralism. We, France, still believe that we are stronger together than if each of us acts alone. And since the end of the Cold War, it's been France's aim to act with its partners to foster, as much as possible, the emergence of a safer world with governance capable of finding collective solutions to the shared challenges we need to address together. And it is my hope that in the coming times, I could even say in the coming days, France will be more than ever keen to get involved in world affairs. For we've always believed that our destiny is linked to that of the rest of mankind. This is our conviction. This is what brought, a little more than 200 years ago, explorers from France to the shores of South Australia, in accordance with the values that have been France's heritage since the Enlightenment. A few words in particular about the European Union. No doubt, Europe is in a period of turmoil. This is the case for France's neighbors and in France itself. First of all, as you know, Europe needs to address the challenge of Brexit. We regret this choice by the British people, but we respect it. It is now up to us, with Britain, to organize the orderly exit of the United Kingdom from the European Union. These negotiations, as you know, have become a reality with the recent activation by the United Kingdom of the procedure under Article 50 of the Treaty of the European Union, what we would call in France a première, because nobody has ever triggered that article. But Britain, according to us, will have to respect a certain number of principles. In particular, I would like to remind you of the position taken recently by the last meeting of the EU Council, meeting of all heads of states and governments. And it says, EU membership involves a package of advantages and of obligation. And no country will be able to keep all the advantages without fulfilling their obligation. For this is a principle, then there will be a negotiation, and a negotiation also can from time to time bring some sort of flexibility to principles, but at least not hurt them directly, not change them fundamentally. For many Australians, Brexit certainly represents the ultimate testament to a so-called European crisis. Is this true? I'm not absolutely certain of that, at least from a French point of view. And I will try to explain that to you. Firstly, because very few of us, sorry Nigel, have ever seen Britain as a pillar of any ambitious European project. And this is not showing any disrespect for Britain, which is a great ally and a great country, but historically speaking, I'm afraid what I've just said is true, at least from a French point of view. By saying that, I just wish to remind you that Britain refused to take part in the very first steps of the formation of the EU, the so-called Schuman Plan, named after a French foreign minister, Schuman. And Britain actually not only refused to take part in these very first steps, but tried to create an alternative project called the EFTA, European Free Trade Agreement, in 1960, with Nordic countries and a few others like Austria, Portugal, Ireland. And then Britain finally decided to lobby to become a member when it realized that there was much more momentum on the European community side. Always pragmatic, this is one of the British virtues, as you know. What happened next? According to the principle, the permanent principle of British foreign policy, balance of power in Europe, the UK suddenly chose to abandon both the FTA and parts of its special relations with former dominions and Commonwealth countries. Some of you remember that, or many of you. But since it became a full member in 1973, Britain has always been a pretty special member of the club, having one foot in and one foot out of the EU. Even though we have to recognize and to pay tribute to the fact that Britain has been pretty influential in the way the EU has evolved in the past 30 years or so. And this is actually indeed the paradox of the Brexit. The UK is living a union that it has very efficiently influenced and shaped. In a way, the current European Union is a creator of London. Actually, the evolution of the EU since then, since the early 70s, has been at odds with the French vision of Europe. This vision, our vision, since the beginning, was that of a much more integrated, if not federal, union with fewer members. We succeeded partly when we created a common currency at the end of the past century, 1999, and transferred our monetary policy to a common central bank. But in many other areas, notably security, defense, or even fiscal policy, very little has been achieved to face the many challenges of the continent. Not always, of course, because of Britain alone, but it is true to say that never have any of these projects had the support of the UK. We can see now that the idea of a more integrated European Union is being raised by Germany and France since Brexit, and without doubt, much more likely to succeed because of Brexit. So in my opinion, Brexit might not be the cause of the European crisis, but could, on the other hand, provide the opportunity to reset the European project without Britain. And as I said before, the people of France and the government in France were pretty much in favor of Britain remaining a member of the European Union. But since the British people have decided, we have to see that as an opportunity. In a way, the Europeans will perhaps, in a few years from now, thank Britain for having decided to ask for divorce. It's not yet a happy ending, of course, but it certainly provides room for maneuver. Yet, it will also depend on how much energy will be needed to cut the current ties with Britain and imagine and shape a necessary new relationship with a very close neighbor and a closer ally. In France, people are not that worried about Brexit, because whatever the new relationship between the EU and the UK is, France will maintain a strong relationship with the UK, especially in the field of defense, because at the moment we are the only two nations in Europe that are able to invest heavily in defense and that still sustain sovereign industries, which unfortunately is not yet the case in other European countries. So, after having said that, what is, according to me, the true challenges for the European Union? I believe one of the problems is that the European project has promised too much in terms of prosperity and economic welfare. When I was a student, and later when I started my career in the Treasury in Paris, there was a widely shared belief that the EU would be the solution to all our challenges, and that it would pave the way to a more prosperous, more competitive union. Alas, we haven't been able to avoid a contamination from the US financial system, the GFC, nor to protect ourselves from the impact of globalization and the rise of China on our industry and jobs. But there's one reason for that you certainly know, but that I want to remind you. The current European project was shaped just after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Of course, there's been a first project in the late 50s, then another one in the early 80s, but the current project and the very last treaties that were signed between European member states, all of that was shaped just after the Berlin Wall. And you remember, at the time, academics were talking about the end of history, the final victory of market-based economy and of multilateral regulations. And it was shaped in order to provide to the Union economic benefits in a global world, not to promote security, not to deal with immigration waves, or even confront an aggressive and dangerous Russia. Russia wasn't at all aggressive. Russia was pretty weak during the 90s, so it was not a problem. So, today, it is of the utmost importance for our countries to be able to cope now with these issues and to do it pretty quickly on the assumption that after September this year, France and Germany will have two newly elected governments willing to work together and once again lead the other European Union members towards another chapter of European integration. But to do so, these governments, our leaders, will have to find the right narrative, sometimes something we deeply lack today. And this narrative will have to be both ambitious and realistic. For me, there's another issue that has to do with Eastern European members. Today, the relationship between West and East in Europe is a matter of more questions than answers. I hope that we, the East and the West, still share the same vision and more, the same values. It appears that in these countries that are member states, the attraction of the West has faded. Other influences are pulling these communities back into the past or to the East. We notice the same dynamic in the Balkans. Powerful and influential neighbors are without doubt willing to undermine the European Union. This is actually the project of Mr. Putin. But then comes another, a much more recent and probably even more tricky question. Will the US play a similar role for the very first time ever? Will the US have in mind not to support, but also to undermine the European Union? Nobody at that stage can answer this question. In the West itself of the European Union, the rise of populism is seen as another element of a European crisis. But as you know, it's not only a European disease. In our case, France, it's a direct consequence of an increasing gap between the narrative of the establishment and the self-perception of the people. Just a few examples with regards to the so-called four pillars of the Union, the European Union. When we, the establishment, talk about free movements of people as something very important, most people think about illegal immigration. When we talk about free exchanges of goods, many people think about cheap products from emerging countries destroying local production. When we talk about services, people have in mind Eastern European plumbers or carpenters coming to work in Western countries of the EU and competing unfairly with local workers. Finally, when we talk about free movements of capital, people think about the GFC and its terrible consequences. So this is the gap between the narrative of the establishment or the principles supported by the establishment and the self-perceptions of many of our people in our communities. Taking all this into account, the next election in France, actually 2 or 3 elections, one for the president, starting next Sunday, one for the lower house in June, and another for the upper house, the Senate, it's September. The next elections will be a major test, not only for us, the French, but for Europe. There is no doubt about that. The polls at that stage reflect a rather high level of support for the Front National, the National Front, for the not particularly French reasons I've mentioned, because similar parties are also strong in the Netherlands, in Italy, in Sweden, in Finland, even in the UK with UKIP. But I also have to say that the election of Mr. Trump in the US provided a great opportunity for Marine Le Pen, the leader of the National Front. She is now more legitimate and in a way more credible, as many of her proposals are similar to Mr. Trump's. On immigrations, France first, sounds like America first, and a few other issues. So nothing inherently French, except that in my country, the two major parties have failed to reform the nations while sharing, since the 90s, a similar vision with few nuances in reality. And this vision was that the single currency, the euro, should exercise a constraints on governments to spend less and companies to be more competitive, and then naturally narrow the gap between economies and policies of member states of the Eurozone. It was supposed to be some sort of magic formula, that would bring closer and closer countries that had quite a different political but more economical background. The problem is that it didn't work as expected, this dream of the early years of this century, and that some countries in Europe appear to have benefited from the single currency, while others have been struggling since they adopted the euro. France sits perfectly in the middle, with half the population benefiting from the rules of the game, and the other half being or feeling that they are being marginalized. For that reason, the legitimacy of the traditional parties that supported this sort of bipartisan policy has never been so weak than today. This is also why the two candidates that could qualify for the second round of the election next Sunday belong either to a populist party, the National Front, that has never been part of government, or to no party at all. The second one, Emmanuel Macron, second candidate, who could become the president of France, according to the most recent polls, has never been elected to a public office. He's a former investment banker, has never been elected at any level in the French Republic, and wishes to rally people from the left, the center, and the right, and to send into retirement most of the establishment. Following these two front runners is another populist from the left who admires Fidel Castro and the president of Venezuela. Then come the candidates of the Liberal Conservative and the candidate of the ruling Socialist Party. According to certain polls, they are ranking 4th and 5th. Since 1958, the creation of the so-called Fifth Republic, these two parties have been in government, and today they could be defeated before even getting to the second round of the election. Nevertheless, I do hope that in a couple of days, France will surprise the world positively. I believe there is momentum for another French Revolution, as the Economist newspaper in Britain recently put it in its front page, but not the sort of revolution they are predicting with the National Front winning the election. A revolution based on the assumption that our old country can be on the move again and bring ambition, enthusiasm, stability to the European project and so to the world. As I said before, I'm convinced that no single government can efficiently manage in this century the issues we need to address. For that reason, there's no other option to work with like-minded countries, both in Europe and around the world. But I have to say that this club is not that packed, and that more and more members that were more and more countries that could have been or were seen as being part of that club of like-minded countries can no longer be considered as being part of it truly. For that reason, probably, because the club is not that packed, Australia has become a strategic partner for France. Our two countries share the same vision of a world open for human, economic, commercial, and intellectual exchanges. Our ties are all the more solid because this community of values is bolstered by our geographical, I will come back to that, and historical proximity. Of course, you all know the ties between our nations were born in the trenches and on the battlefields of the Great War. Since 2014, we've had many opportunities to express our gratitude to the people of Australia. After 2 visits to France by your Governor General in 2016, this year we will be commemorating the Battle of Bullecourt and inaugurating the Villers-Bretonneux Interpretation Centre in 2018, which will enable visitors to better understand the history of the site and what the Australians did for us at one of the darkest hours of our modern history, together with the British, when Paris was very much at stake. Australia, once again, flew to France's aid during the Second World War, being part of the Allied, and I will have the pleasure, during this visit to South Australia tomorrow morning, of decorating veterans who fought for the liberation of France during the landings with my country's highest distinction, the Legion of Honor, tomorrow morning. These historical ties are, of course, the foundations, the cornerstone of the mutual confidence that has led Australia to choose France for the renewal of your fleet of oceanic submarines. France, meanwhile, has made the political choice to offer Australia technology transfers in areas essential to the national security of both our countries. And maybe in 20 or 30 years from now, you and I will have the opportunity to read the minutes of the meeting of the French National Security Council when the decision was taken to offer to Australia and to transfer to Australia technology that we had never shared with anybody, even with the Americans, that probably don't need them, but they have their own, or with the Brits, that has, as I said, a very close allies in terms of defense and much more. It was quite interesting to read the sort of debates that took place around the President of the Republic with the senior ministers and the heads of the French defense forces. And the only thing I can say, because if I say too much I will be imprisoned, jailed in my country, is that after maybe some sort of warm-up presentations of the issues that had to do with the Australian contract, most or all of the people, very important people that were on the table, unanimously supported the idea that we could transfer to Australia what represents for us our life insurance. So this common choice by our two countries means committing to a program that will, for the next 50 years, contribute to building here in South Australia a sovereign, sustainable Australian industry, and it means also biding our destinies. Because we share views on most issues and act together quite often. And this is something quite unique because, as I said before, there are many countries with which we share views. We have the same vision of what's happening in the world. But when it comes to acting, when it comes to do something to preserve or to implement our vision, there are not that many around us. Of course, there's the United States. Sometimes they act without asking the others if they agree and if they want to be part of that. But there's Britain, as I said, for the historical reasons that all of you know. But then there's Australia, and that's something that needs to be, more and more explained. For that reason, France's believe that it is in its interest to work closely with a strong Australia, an Australia that contributes to the stability of this region. That is to say, a strong Australia that shoulders growing responsibility at international level. There are not that many countries that have this mindset. Of course, there is always matter for discussion between us, which indeed reflects debate within our own democratic societies, such as on the fight against climate change. Sometimes we agree with some states of Australia, especially this one, and we've had more, broader discussions with the federal level. Fight against climate change, also how to manage the difficult issue of refugees and migrants. We're not a model at all for the reasons I mentioned, but sometimes we have to talk about that and try to find a common views. Not always that easy. But today, what is true is that we are facing the same threats and the same challenges. You certainly know that France and Australia are fighting side by side in the Middle East within the coalition against Daesh, in a brotherhood of arms mirroring our alliance 1 century ago. Almost every day, Australian refuelers do refuel French fighters over Syria and Iraq. We have we share the same parts of, we have bases, air bases, pretty close one to each other in the Emirates, where our Air Force operates pretty jointly. More generally, our intelligence cooperation is currently at an unprecedented level, with a shared concern regarding the processes of radicalization, the issue of returning foreign fighters, and the financing of terrorism. Beyond that, the aim for an enhanced partnership is to develop our relationship in all areas. And I have to say that South Australia is probably a bit in advance, and what we do here is a model of what we should do, not only in South Australia, but we're pretty happy to do it here with all of you. Talking about economic and commercial exchanges, they're doing pretty well. French companies are present in many sectors, if not all, in Australia, where they employ more than 60,000 people. We are stepping up, and we discussed that before with you, Nigel, and Anthony, our scientific and technological cooperation, our exchanges of young researchers in key fields for the society and the industry of the future, digital technology, IT, leading edge engineering, biodiversity, healthcare, space, and agro-environmental research. We also want to see greater cultural exchanges and people-to-people exchanges. That does not mean starting from scratch, as more than 20,000 young French people visit Australia every year under the Working Holiday Program, and a further 4,000 others study in Australia. Meanwhile, France receives more than 1.2 million Australian tourists every year, maybe many of you, I hope. But we have the ambition to do better. And another fundamental aspect of our relationship is our geographic proximity. That sounds sometimes like a joke, but it's a reality. When you ask a French with which country do we have the largest, border, maritime border? Some would say, of course, Britain, some others, I don't know, Spain, but in reality, it is with you. It is with Australia that we share the largest maritime borders because of our territories in the Pacific. Fewer of you, no doubt, know that we are also neighbors in the Indian Ocean. As you are aware, France has still a rather considerable overseas presence, which is an essential part of its identity and culture. The Pacific and Indian Oceans are home to more than 1.6 million of my fellow citizens. In these two highly strategic regions, both France and Australia are committed to combating trafficking, guaranteeing sustainable development, which is respectful of the environment and ecosystems that are precious for small island states and territories. But also, we work together in order to ensure freedom of navigation and to promote peaceful settlement of disputes in accordance with international laws. This, of course, may seem some sort of very diplomatic, language, but it means that very precisely when you have in mind, for instance, South China Sea, like Australia, France will continue to sail its ships and fly its aircraft everywhere where operational needs command and where international laws allows. And this is something we are the only European country to do at the moment in excellent cooperation with Australia. Every time, and it happens quite often, a French warship goes into that part of the world. Before doing that, we transmit to Australia the route our vessel will follow, and after it has returned to its harbor or to an Australian port, we organize complete debriefing with the Australian Navy to exchange views on the sort of contacts we've had with China. 540,000 French people live in Oceania, in New Caledonia, in French Polynesia, and in Wallis and Futuna. The capital cities of these territories, Nouméa, New Caledonia, and Papeete, French Polynesia, now enjoy very large degrees of autonomy, enabling them to make decisions in most areas, excluding monetary policy and defense. Foreign affairs, for instance, are a shared competence with the French government. The development of ties between these territories and their immediate environment is for us absolutely fundamental. And it saw great success during the most recent Pacific Island Forum in September 2016, which welcomed New Caledonia and French Polynesia as full members. This was a long-standing aspiration that could not have come about without Australia's support. These territories wish to further develop their regional economic relationship, including with Australia, of course, and France, Paris, will continue to support them to realize that ambition. I have to say that you probably remember that in the 80s, the situation in New Caledonia was a matter of controversy between Australia and France. At the time, there were three difficulties between us. The first one was the one I mentioned, New Caledonia. Australia didn't share the same visions about the political process, if I may call it like that, in that French territory. The second issue was, of course, about nuclear tests in the Pacific. And the third had to do with the Common Agricultural Policy, the called CAP, European policy, heavily supported by France, and that was seen by Australians as interfering with fair competition in that domain. All these three issues have been solved very positively, and that's the reason why now we're living through this sort of honeymoon. Dear friends, just to conclude, I will say that I've tried to describe, and try not being too long, that these are not times for naivety or for burying our heads in the sand. A very famous Australian, is he Australian? The Sleepwalkers, yeah, I think he's Australian or British. Australian. No, wrote a very interesting book that was even translated in French maybe 3 years ago regarding how the First World War started. And the title explains everything. It's called The Sleepwalkers. I mean, our governments, our community could have seen that something horrible what was coming, was happening, and nobody did anything to stop it. So it is not time to bury our heads in the sand. This is a time of uncertainty and of many threats to what we've, for many decades, taken for granted. For this reason, it's more than ever a time for alliance to defend an open and dynamic worldview. These alliances have to be based on the conviction that our security cannot be guaranteed by isolationism, but only by an effort to provide a framework for the international community that will strengthen collective security, ensuring that global trade is of benefit to everyone and combating climate change and environmental degradation. Of course, we have to do the first circle of our interests as a French is the European Union. This is the reason why I do hope that we'll be able, in the context that I described previously, to reset this project. But the second circle is made of like-minded countries, and Australia plays a major role in that circle. That is exactly what France and Australia want to do. That is at the core of our bilateral relationship, and I've been lucky enough to have played a role in what we've been able to achieve in less than 3 years, which has totally transformed the nature and the density of this relationship. That is how, working together, we will live a world of hope, a world of peace, security, freedom, and progress to future generations. It's not an easy task, but it's a very exciting one. Thank you very much.
Please thank Christophe Lecourtier.